The Middle Passage, a name now etched in the darkest chapters of human history, was the brutal journey across the Atlantic Ocean that millions of African men, women, and children were forced to endure during the Transatlantic Slave Trade. It occurred from the 16th century until the 19th century, with its peak in the 18th century. This journey, filled with unimaginable suffering and despair, was the heart of the slave trade system that sent Africans to the Americas to work on plantations, in mines, and in households as slaves. Kofi, a young boy from a coastal village in West Africa, was one of the many who would come to embody the horrors of the Middle Passage. Kofi's life was one of simplicity and peace before that fateful day. He lived with his family in a small village, nestled near the warm shores of what Europeans would later call the Gold Coast. His days were filled with the rhythm of village life, helping his father tend to the crops, learning stories from his mother, and playing with friends under the shade of the tall trees. But that peace was shattered one morning when foreign soldiers, armed with muskets and chains, stormed through their village. Kofi watched in helpless disbelief as his mother was torn from his arms, as his father was shackled, and as his village became a place of captivity. These were men who saw no humanity in him, only a commodity to be taken and sold. The soldiers rounded up the villagers, forcing them into iron shackles and marched them toward the coastal port. Along the way many were beaten, some died from exhaustion, and others simply couldn't bear the thought of the future that awaited them. Kofi, just 16 years old, struggled to understand what was happening. He had heard rumors of slavery, but he never imagined that he would become part of that brutal system. It wasn't until they reached the port that he first laid eyes on the ships, the enormous black vessels that would carry them into a new, unimaginable life. The sight of the ships sent a chill through him, but he could not look away. He didn't know then that these ships would carry him and thousands like him to places where their names and faces would be forgotten, where their lives would be defined by suffering and forced labor. The journey across the Atlantic was an ordeal that Kofi would never be able to fully describe. He was crammed into the hold of a slave ship with hundreds of other captured Africans, their bodies shackled together in tight quarters, unable to move or even breathe freely. The conditions below deck were unbearable. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, human waste, and disease. The temperature was oppressive, and the walls of the ship seemed to close in with each passing day. The men, women, and children who had once lived vibrant lives now existed in a nightmarish world of darkness, fear, and uncertainty. Many of them, like Kofi, were already sick from the forced march, weakened from hunger and dehydration, but they had no choice but to endure. Kofi's body began to waste away under the conditions, and many of the others who had been taken from his village, along with strangers from across the continent, began to die. Their bodies were tossed overboard, disappearing into the vast ocean, as though their lives had never mattered. The screams of the dying, the cries of the children, and the prayers of the oppressed filled the air as the days stretched into weeks. Time lost meaning as Kofi fought to stay conscious, to keep his mind from breaking under the weight of it all. Yet through it all, one thought kept him alive, the thought of his family, of his home. Though he was far from them, Kofi held on to his name, his identity, as the only thing that had not been taken from him. The months at sea were a blur of suffering, hunger, and fear, but eventually, the ship reached its destination. Kofi could feel the change in the air as the ship neared the coast of what would later become the Americas. The stench of salt water grew stronger, and the sounds of the waves crashing against the ship seemed louder. The survivors were dragged from the hold, their shackles rattling as they were forced to march across the dock. They were paraded in front of a crowd of European buyers, who inspected them like animals on display, appraising their worth, measuring their bodies for strength and stamina. Kofi, weak and barely able to stand, was pushed forward with the others. He could see the glint of gold coins in the hands of the buyers, the ruthless way they bargained for human lives. He did not know what fate awaited him, but he knew that whatever it was, it would be grim. The Middle Passage had already stripped him of his innocence, his freedom, his past. Now, he would become just another nameless, faceless slave, sold to the highest bidder. The auction block was where the last shreds of dignity were stripped away. Kofi's body, once a symbol of youth and promise, was now reduced to nothing more than a commodity. His identity, his very being, was disregarded in favor of his labor. He would be forced to work the land, to toil under the burning sun, to live a life of servitude, never again knowing the freedom of his homeland. Yet, even in that moment of despair, Kofi did not forget who he was. He refused to let the world define him by his chains. He clung to his name, Kofi, as a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable suffering, there was still a piece of him that could not be erased. The Middle Passage was a journey that crushed millions of spirits, that broke bodies, that stole lives. It was a journey that left scars so deep they would never heal, but it was also a journey of survival. For every Kofi who survived, there were countless others who did not. And for every person who endured the horrors of the Middle Passage, there were generations who would rise up and fight for freedom, who would demand their right to be seen, to be heard, to be human. The Middle Passage was not the end of their story, it was just the beginning.